Hello and welcome to a brand new Arseblog Arsecast right here on arseblog.com. How are you? I hope you're well. Wherever you are in this crazy world right now, I hope you and yours are doing okay, keeping safe and sound. Glad to have you along as always. We have got plenty to talk about on today's show. We'll be looking back at the game against Chelsea, and of course we'll be taking in some of the more broad issues regarding this season, where we are, what we can still achieve, if anything, the manager, all the talk of recruitment and rebuilding and resetting and backing from the owners and all of that kind of stuff. That's all to come between now and the end of the show. It is quite funny, though, isn't it, that in this crazy season where we have dropped so many ridiculous points, you think about Burnley and the way we lost those games, you think about losing to Everton, you think about almost losing to Fulham, you think about losing twice to Aston Villa, and I'm not saying we've any divine right to win any of those games, but I think it's reasonable to expect that Arsenal would produce a better points total from those games than we did. But amid all that, we managed to beat Chelsea twice, home and away, for the first time since 2003-2004, when I think we had a pretty good year, pretty good season that season, and that's the last time we beat Chelsea home and away. And we've managed it this season. And look, you know, beating Chelsea away 1-0 at Stamford Bridge in a performance in which we were kind of hanging on, but in which we played pretty defensively, whether by design or simply the circumstances of the game. Look, nobody is saying that this means everything is okay. Nobody is saying that, you know, because we beat Chelsea, it makes going out to Villarreal the way we did okay. Of course not. That's nonsense. But look, you've been here as long as I've been here throughout this season. You've watched every minute of every game. You've read all the blogs. You've read the news pieces, the player ratings. You've listened to the podcasts. You've been there, done that, worn the t-shirt. You've experienced it all, and lots of it has been shit. Like really inexcusably shit. And I think you can recognize that on one hand, and on the other, take some joy in the fact that we have beaten Chelsea away from home. Beaten them at their place. Old Tommy Tickle's post-match interview, he was so annoyed, he was so angry with himself. Fine, that's great, but things like that, small things that we can all enjoy as football fans, you've got to take them. You have to. Don't deny yourself the small bits which are good this season because you're so pissed off with everything else. It doesn't mean you can't be pissed off with everything else. And I know the game itself was essentially meaningless, but it's a London derby. We've beaten Chelsea away from home. We've beaten them at home. John Terry was sad. Ashley Cole was sad. Frank Lampard was probably sad. Who else? All of them. All of those fuckers were sad. All their fans were sad. Sure, they've got a couple of insignificant cup finals to soften the blow of losing to Arsenal at this stage of the season, but still, I liked it in a really kind of perverse way because, look, first and foremost, there wasn't the pressure, was there, that normally there would be in a game like this because our season is pretty much done and dusted. So there's a kind of like, not that you don't care, but it doesn't mean as much. So you can kind of relax into the game, and then you score a goal because Mr. Tumnus makes a mistake, and Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, he sets up Emile Smith Rowe, who's this wonderfully precocious, incredibly talented footballer that we have who's come through our academy, and if we can keep him fit, boy, oh boy, am I going to be enjoying watching him play for Arsenal. And then Chelsea come back, and they, you know, Leno makes some saves, and late on they hit the bar a couple of times, and we defend with our lives. And it's like we embraced our crapness. We embraced it. We played the back three. We said, come on, have a go. And they had a go. And we more or less contained them, apart from a few little moments here and there. We embraced our crapness and won. And in a season which has delivered so very little at key moments, I'm happy to take my enjoyment where I can get it. Might be a different story next week when Attilio Lombardo comes off the bench for Crystal Palace to score a winner for them in the last minute. But hey, right now, This is where I am, and this is what I'm doing. Okay, let's get on with the show. And delighted to welcome back to talk about the game against Chelsea and to talk about a lot of interesting stuff that's happened this week. Mikel Arteta's post-match interview, for example, with Sky, where he was very frustrated with the way that some of his comments have been portrayed in the media. And I can kind of understand why. I'll explain during the conversation here with James Benge from CBS Sports. Hi, James.
Hi, Andrew. How are you?
I'm all right. Chelsea away, Arsenal 1, Chelsea 0. Not perhaps the most comprehensive or exhilarating performance from an Arsenal point of view, but in a season where results have been, well, really not good enough, you've got to take your enjoyment where you get it. That's a great result, regardless of how it happened.
I mean, in a way, I enjoyed it more because of how it happened. It was the clown shoe was very much on the other foot for once. It was some. There's just something quite, there is something quite joyous, and I don't think Arsenal fans should be ashamed to admit that it's really funny when these errors that Arsenal keep making happen in Arsenal's favour. And I think the way it was sort of, that Kepa in theory looked like the fall guy, and he did nothing, but he'd really done nothing wrong, and totally normal reaction to just push the ball away from the goal. And he probably would have, Arsenal would have had my only complaint is that Arsenal would have had an indirect free kick on the 6-yard line, and I think they're the most fun things in all football. Watching, I guess, Aubameyang. I mean, David Luiz would have taken it and got it over the bar somehow, wouldn't he? He'd have fanned away on the pitch and hammered it into Rose Ed. But I mean, it wasn't vintage. I think it's a bit. We kind of see these games a bit too much with Arteta, particularly late in the season. Backs to the wall. Our actual plans and underlying philosophy have all gone to pot, but we can defend every once in a while for 90 minutes. But in the end, you can't. There's no sense in complaining too much about beating Chelsea. These are the games to enjoy, and in a way, I think there is almost an extra bit of enjoyment to be taken from winning it in a way where you didn't really deserve to win. And as Thomas Tuchel said, Chelsea were the better team, although they didn't create that much. But these are fun wins as much as the hammerings, in other games as well. It
is nice to know that a team which is considered far better than us, and look, they're in the FA Cup final, the Champions League final, and they've been very good under Thomas Tuchel. Can contrive to lose a game in a way which is very Arsenal-esque, if you like. And the goal is quite interesting, isn't it? Because, there was a lot of talk, and I've seen a lot of people talk about this afterwards, that, Kepa handling the ball on the line, people were going, well, why wasn't he sent off for denying a clear goal? And what you can't do is give handball against the goalkeeper in the box. It would have been, as you say, an indirect free kick from the 6-yard line. So I'm glad the referee let it go on. But I think, if you step back from it, and we scored, and it was Emile Smith Rowe's goal, and we're going to talk about him now in a second, but there's probably a good case to be made that the punishment for a goalkeeper doing that in those circumstances is not sufficient. Like the goalkeeper clawing the ball off the line just as it's about to go in with his hand, knowing it's a back pass, is an indirect free kick does not seem like adequate punishment. It should, at the very least, I think, be a penalty. So there's room, I think, for. I mean, it's an incident which doesn't happen very often, but it's an example of how, when you see it, you can say, well, that wouldn't have been fair to Arsenal if the referee had blown and we got a 6-yard free kick, or a free kick from 6 yards, and Chelsea can put basically 11 men in the goal to block the shot.
Would have been funny, though. But I agree. I think there's so many, that we've seen throughout this season that as much as we want to blame VAR and we want to blame officials, and neither are flawless by any stretch of the imagination, but I think both are worth persevering with. That really a lot of where the work needs to be done is just on tidying up the laws a little bit, adding a degree of common sense. We saw this with the the triple punishment when a goalkeeper fouls a player that's running through and he denies a clear goal scoring opportunity, and you can end up with a red card and a penalty and no goalkeeper. And I think, that obviously is probably cleaving a little too far towards, game ruining punishment. Obviously, we all remember Paris back in 2006. But then you're completely right that it doesn't feel fair that you can palm the ball off the line and there's no real no real punishment. And, I would suspect that if Arsenal had got that free kick on the 6-yard box, that, Arsenal or most teams probably would find it really difficult to score against, because you're almost facing, half a dozen goalkeepers, really. Just some of them aren't using their hands.
Yeah.
But then, I wonder if this is just, there are always ways of gaming the rules in your favour, aren't there? Someone was saying to me the other day that if it ever goes to a penalty shootout, in a Europa League game or a Euros game, basically the smartest tactic would just be to go and break the legs of the opposing goalkeeper, take the red card.
That's okay. I mean, not that we should advocate inflicting that kind of violence on anyone. Well, at least most people. But there is probably a loophole there that could be exploited if you were a team cynical enough to behave in that particularly ultra-violent way.
Stoke.
Yeah. Well, look, Ryan Shawcross as manager. Watch out for any team that's involved in a penalty shootout with him. Look, let's talk about Emile Smith Rowe, because I know he's a player you like, and I think he's a player that all of us really like. And since he arrived, well, it's wrong to say he arrived on the scene this year. He's been around the first team for a couple of years now and was involved in pre-season a couple of years ago and really shone, played some Europa League minutes. He had that loan to Germany, which didn't work out because of injury, loan to Huddersfield, which went pretty well for him. We could all see there was a talent there, and I think the question mark, as is quite often the case with young players, it isn't necessarily just the talent or the ability that they have, because you don't get to the fringes of a team like Arsenal without having exceptional talent and ability, really, his issues seem to have been physical. And I was worried the other day when Mikel Arteta said, when he came off against West Brom, is a bit of a hamstring thing. He was feeling something in it. That's been happening a lot lately because he's still getting used to the demands of playing, regular first team football at this level. And then he plays against Chelsea and he does the 90 minutes and he played with an energy and an effervescence that, is infectious. It's hard not to look at this kid and think, wow, like if we can keep him fit, he's going to be really something. Like he reminds me a lot of Paul Merson, and he reminds me a bit of Thomas Rosicky as well, a Thomas Rosicky, if you like. Just in terms of the way he wants to go forward. He always wants to be positive in how he plays. The goal, it's not the sweetest strike he'll ever score in his life, but it's damn important to score a goal away from home against Chelsea, and it comes 3 days after he scored his first Premier League goal for the club. So there really is something happening with this young man, isn't there?
It's really encouraging and invigorating. Like you said, this isn't an overnight thing, but equally I think we have to acknowledge the strides that were taken in 6 months when Mikel Arteta threw Emile Smith Rowe in at the deep end because there was no real option, and effectively challenged him and Saka and Martinelli. I mean, we'll never quite know, but it felt like it was the you guys need to save my job moment. Obviously we can't know, but they've risen to that occasion, and I think we can say the same thing for Saka. We can say the same thing for Tierney and Martinelli. These young players, it's not that they're fearless. I think it's that they embrace the pressure. And they embrace the moment, and that's why, he really reminds me of Thomas Rosicky in that Rosicky would always play at his best on the biggest occasions. I remember he was fantastic whenever he was fit enough for a North London derby. And as you say, when the ball comes to him, you can almost see he's collecting it on the half turn, looking immediately. Whatever the situation, he's going to try and push Arsenal forward up the pitch. I think, from a stats perspective, I think among sort of attacking midfielders, players in his position, he's one of the highest in terms of forward passes per game and, proportion of his passes that go forward among the Arsenal players. The injury thing, Arteta obviously, as you'll remember, said a similar thing about Saka a few months back. And I do think he deserves a degree of sympathy in that when these young players are your most consistent performers, when they're the players that are kind of transformative, imaginative, and consistently giving you 8 out of 10 performances in a way you would generally expect from someone that's 28, 29. And when your 28, 29-year-olds aren't doing that, they're not playing exceptionally. they kind of have to be among the first names on the team sheet, and you kind of can't not play them against teams like Chelsea because, you want to win. Even if this is a bit of a dead rubber, it's a dead rubber against a rival, and it's a chance to build momentum, or at least to quieten down some of the tough talk around you. So you do have to play them maybe more than you would like in an ideal world, because you can't rely on Willian. You can't rely on, I'm not going to name any others, but a lot of those forward players are not performing as consistently as Smith Rowe. As for the injuries, I think a lot of it really does go back to that initial issue, which, as I understand it, Arsenal really mishandled back in that first season when he broke through with Unai Emery. They took him to Poltava. Was it a Europa League game away to Poltava when he was already feeling some pain in his groin?
Poltava?
He flew, heard of that. And that's really when those injury issues started. I think that groin issue is one that's quite common for players of his age. It's a sort of growing pain thing, was how one person described it to me. And I think because he's always been coming back to fitness, you do end up playing a bit early. You've not got the rhythm. I don't think he's really had a full pre-season at all since the breakout pre-season. Yeah, he was injured when they went to America. He travelled but wasn't able to play. And then obviously the following season, he played a little bit, got the shoulder injury. So it stops and starts. I think it's really easy for Arsenal fans to panic about this. They've had so many great creative midfielders that injuries have really struck them down and spoiled them. But I think give Smith Rowe this full pre-season, hope he gets through it fit. And maybe, it's difficult to know, because he's the type of player that will get, like Benge used to say about Wilshere, he's going to get his ankles clipped a lot. But I would hope it's nothing serious and it is just, a bit of bad luck.
There is talk of a Vorskla, I think was the team you were referring to there. I couldn't figure out who it was you were talking about there. Yeah. There is talk of a new contract for him. He's got 2 years left on his current deal, but given the breakthrough, given the increased importance that he has and the contribution that he has made this season, I know in all competitions, he's got a reasonable number of goals and assists to his name, considering his season only really started in December. It is the time to tie him down, to make sure that along with Tierney, along with Saka, along with Martinelli, you've got these guys on a long-term contract, that their future is secured, it's tied to the club, because as much as we have to do this summer, and that's obviously something we're going to chat about now in a minute, making sure you hang on to the best things you have is really, really important. And next season, it would be great going into it knowing that for the next 5 years, Smith Rowe, Saka, Tierney, Martinelli are with us, and we have that sort of safety net with them. And look, a big part of holding on to talented young players is making sure that you have a team that talented young players can thrive in and feel like they can make progression in, because if they don't, there are a lot of teams out there that will quite happily snatch them up. So new contract for Smith Rowe next season, and maybe a new number.
Oh, a new number would be great. I remember speaking to him about Mesut Ozil, and I was just sort of when you sort of say like take the number 10, the number 10, and you kind of mean it in that positional thing. And he basically said to me, "Oh yeah, no, Mesut's great, but I'm paraphrasing here, but effectively what he said is when he goes, I'd really like the number 10." So I think that would be a really fantastic gesture, and I'm sure it's something he'd like. As for the contract, I know obviously there are reports that those talks are underway. I couldn't speak to that, but what I can say is, earlier when he was really starting to break through, there was brief conversations between Smith Rowe's representatives and Arsenal, just sort of saying, look, let's park this until the season is over. Now, I think we could probably argue Arsenal season is really over now. Yeah. And let you focus on football. It'll come. both sides, there's a really strong will to tie him down, to get it all agreed. From Arsenal's perspective, to put together a pay packet that reflects his status.
Yeah,
and it's worth noting that that's something they did last summer as well. Martinelli was effectively just given a 1-year extension, but really what it was a pay rise to reflect the fact that he's not an under-23s player anymore. He's a first teamer, and I'm sure the same will be true for Smith Rowe. It's a really shrewd, safe investment, and I think we'll talk about squad building, I'm sure, but one of the really interesting things the whole Ødegaard experience has taught us, and I think Ødegaard is probably in that grey area whether you want to keep him and try and buy him for a lot of money. But you could certainly go into next season feeling confident if Smith Rowe was your starting number 10 and your alternative was a really good quality alternative who you can rotate in and out with. But I don't think there's now any fear that Smith Rowe can take this role and run with it next season as the full-time 10.
Yeah, I mean, look, Ødegaard would be lovely, and I like him a lot as a player. I think, the last few weeks have been quite difficult for him. I don't think he's the same since the ankle injury that he picked up on international duty. And, to go through a 38-game season at 20, 21 years of age and play every game, I don't think it's realistic for Smith Rowe. But, if Smith Rowe can play 75% of those games, then I think his development curve would be such that, you could maybe live without someone like Ødegaard or spend that money elsewhere, Don't get me wrong, I would take both if I could, but, realistically, we kind of have to cut our cloth. Just one other small issue from the Chelsea game. I wonder, is this a consequence in some ways of just how angsty, we are given the season that we've had, and the last week, 10 days has been particularly difficult and traumatic for Arsenal fans. Aubameyang, when he came off and was replaced by Lacazette, didn't look at all pleased by what had happened. And I think we all look at body language and facial expressions and we read a lot into them. And he's quite an expressive guy, so you can kind of figure out what sort of mood he's in, But is it kind of storm in a teacup sort of stuff? At the end of the day, we won the game. He played, I think, pretty well in the circumstances. He got an assist. He worked hard. He didn't really get any goal-scoring chances. So, I'm not putting him down for not scoring a goal. He got an assist, as I said, for Smith Rowe. He ran around for 80 minutes. He's still coming back from malaria. Is it just one of those things where we look at it and because it's so much else is wrong, we go, well, there's another thing we have to deal with? Is it not the classic example of a player who doesn't want to be substituted being pissed off about being substituted, and that's as far as it goes? Like the old, well, you don't want players being happy to come off kind of thing. Or is there anything in the contention that because he's the captain, he should behave differently in those circumstances?
I probably agree with what you were saying earlier, that it's just a player that's really disappointed to come off, that has run himself into the ground and maybe even thought, we were seeing the game open up in Arsenal's favour, and he wants to be on the pitch in those moments. I think, Tim Stillman makes this point really well on the Arsenal Vision podcast. I think there is for all the success he's had, I don't think Aubameyang is quite as popular a figure among Arsenal supporters as some of us might assume, especially in the press. I don't know what it is, but I think some people just feel a little bit uncomfortable about his expressiveness. I really like it, and I just think how would I react in Aubameyang's situation? And there's not much I can imagine about being a top level footballer, but I can certainly imagine that if I've run myself into the ground, worked really hard for the team, I would be really gutted then to be taken off when I'm, chasing that goal. And it's been a hard season. It's been a really draining, exhausting season personally. Yeah. He spoke so well about that before the Villarreal game, and I know that all gets forgotten, and it's, tomorrow's chip paper. But I think people would do well to remember, how open and honest he was. It's been a tough year. I think that all that stuff probably starts adding up, and you feel it all when you're taken off after a tough game like that Chelsea game. But I wouldn't worry about it. I think he's a high profile player, and therefore his every reaction is mulled over.
I suppose the positive side of that is that he got to 80 minutes having played in a team which was, organised, had to be defensive. I think people sometimes underestimate how difficult that is physically and mentally to be that under pressure. And Arsenal were under pressure in terms of, the territory and how Chelsea were camped in our half. And you've got to be organised. You've got to be disciplined. It takes a lot of legwork and a lot of concentration, and that is tiring. So maybe there's something positive to be taken from the fact that Aubameyang at 80 minutes, given everything that's happened to him of late, felt like he could still contribute something to the game. Like physically, he must have felt okay.
Yeah, I think so. And it is more physically draining, I think, than we all appreciate, running a lot and not touching the ball. And that's mentally draining. I think one of the things, when people get back in stadia, I would encourage them to keep an eye on Aubameyang and how much he is just trying to make those runs, especially when you see someone like Luiz playing. But when he's playing as centre forward, he's hardly touching the ball. I'm looking at the numbers now. Per 90 minutes, he's touching the ball more infrequently than Bernd Leno or Alex Rinnerson. He is, of every outfield player at Arsenal this season, he has the fewest touches per 90. And I think people confuse that with him not being involved and him not working. But actually, Aubameyang is going to be a low touch forward, because if you're playing him as a centre forward, you're playing him to get on the end of stuff. Wherever you're playing him because you trust him when the chances come his way. And I think it's much more draining. It's mentally draining. It's physically draining, and you can't kind of be as instinctive. It's hard. It's hard. It's been a really hard season for Aubameyang, and I think it's really encouraging to see that he is still doing this. He's running the channels. He's pressing. He's making the right decisions when opportunities come his way. He's not chasing the goal from a tight angle. He's giving it to Smith Rowe. It's not been perfect, and he's not been perfect, but I'd really like to, see him next season when there isn't so much going on to distract him.
The win over Chelsea raises the possibility of European football again for Arsenal. Is it 7th in the Premier League, which qualifies for this UEFA Conference League?
Yeah.
So there's a couple of things at play here. One is that if Arsenal were to finish 7th, it would more than likely at this point be at the expense of Tottenham, which is, something I think we could all get behind. St. Totteringham's Day, etc., etc. We've had little enough to cheer. That's a small, invisible, non-existent trophy that we could lift up at the end of the season. At the same time, it might then mean that we've got to play in this UEFA Conference League next season. So I'm curious as to what you're, not about the St. Totteringham's Day thing, because there's no point me asking if people like that. Of course they do. But is that sort of half-ass version of European football still worth something to Arsenal? Or if we are going to embark on what appears to be a summer rebuild and reset and all of those kind of things, would we be better off without that as a club, focusing entirely on playing once a week, more or less, without the midweek distraction and travel and, preparation and all that kind of stuff?
I still haven't quite worked out what I think about this. And I mean, partly because, until a few days ago, it just felt like you could just work off the assumption that it didn't really matter what Arsenal wanted, because this was what they were going to get. But, if you look at Tottenham's run-in, you do think there are points for them to drop. And, I think in the end, there is, people will look at the examples of Chelsea under Antonio Conte and Liverpool under Brendan Rodgers and how they pushed for titles out of nowhere. And it would be deluded for Arsenal and Arsenal fans to think that they would suddenly, just because they're only playing one game a week, they'd suddenly be a contender for the title. But clearly, it would be enormously helpful in terms of a Premier League season if that is pretty much all you're focusing on. And I just think, I remember Darren Burgess when he was at the club, and he took us around the training facilities. And one of the things that still stands out with me was he was talking about how much of a drain this Thursday-Sunday schedule proves to be on players. And some of it's quite hard to explain because, you could, if you're Champions League, you could be Wednesday, Saturday. But it's, it would be flying to really far-flung places. I'm sure Arteta would kind of really overwhelmingly use youngsters, but he'd have to travel. The coaching staff would have to travel and prepare, and they'd have to prepare really hard because the last thing you want is to be humiliated by the third best team in San Marino. I think it would be organisationally just a bit liberating to not have European football. Of course, you love the money that comes with it, and
how much are you getting for the UEFA Conference League?
I have no idea whatsoever. I mean, I'm looking at how little Arsenal get for the Europa League compared to just being in the Champions League. I think if you could sneak into fourth next season, then I think the financial benefits of then just turning up to the Champions League would actually almost outweigh 2 seasons of Europa League football. In fact, I think it might just straight up outweigh it. So I would probably come down on the side of I can't be doing with the Conference League. I think if you add into the mix getting to finish above Tottenham, getting to finish the season on a bit of a high note, it becomes more balanced. Maybe you could just, literally say to Steve Bold, do you want to have a go at this competition? I'm sure Arsenal wouldn't quite be able to do it to that level, but really play the under-23s, play the best young players, and, just say Aubameyang, Partey, Saka, you're not playing in this competition at all. Yeah, but I would just say better off without it, really, if possible.
Yeah, I think as a development tournament, if you could just play young players all the way through, it would have some use. There would be some benefit from that, from giving, the next generation. I think we're probably at a point where there's, some good young players at the club who are maybe not quite just ready to make the step up to first team yet and need either loan football, another season of under-23 football or whatever. So you could really make the case that, look, as a development tournament, it could be pretty useful to give these guys playing time. But if your benefit from being out of Europe or what have you is the fact that the manager can work with the players 5 days a week on the training ground before a weekend game, if the manager has to prepare for a game like that and then travel with the squad and, do his focus has got to be elsewhere. So I have to say, I think like you, I would prefer if we did without it, to be honest. Speaking of Mikel Arteta, I'm sure you saw the post-match interview on Sky Sports, where he was quite unhappy about some things that were doing the rounds in the press, and he said, they're trying to put things on me that I never said. And he was asked about it. He said something I didn't say, and it's quite interesting this, because I watched his press conference the other day. And I was of the opinion that he said something which sounded a bit like he was saying some of the players didn't give their maximum. And it struck me as unusual, because that's not something that he has done. For all his issues this season, that is not something that he has done. And I listened back to the audio, and I'm going to play it here. And I think what has happened is that he's asked a question and then a follow-up question, but he answers the first part of the question. So this is the way the original audio went.
One of the criteria you judge yourself on is by getting the maximum from the players. Do you feel that has happened this season, that the players have given their maximum?
With the majority of them, yes.
So it sounds like he's saying with the majority of them, or have the players given their maximum, and he's saying with the majority. So it makes you go, ooh, some of them haven't been giving their best. I think it makes a lot more sense if you take out that follow-up question. It sounds like this.
One of the criteria you judge yourself on is by getting the maximum from the players. Do you feel that has happened this season?
With the majority of them, yes.
So later in a Sky Sports interview, he said, if I don't get 120% from each player, it's my fault and my responsibility. It wasn't said like this in the press, and I'm so annoyed with that. And I think genuinely what's happened here is a misunderstanding. That he has answered the first part of that question and not really heard the second part, but we all, as we listened to it, thought, oh shit, he's answered that second part of the question and said, well, the majority of them, but that means there's a minority of them that haven't given their best. Who's he talking about? Which players is he throwing under the bus here? And that's really not his style.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, so I wasn't in this press conference for once, but kind of coming to it fresh, I really agree with that version of it. And I think what I still found strange though was, you know, he clearly did not mean to, but he did in effect answer that question. And obviously what this is what I meant to say and what you've received are two really different things. And I mean, I agree. Arteta was not doing this maliciously. I think he was very self-critical, and we've seen throughout the highs and lows of this Arsenal season that he is willing to, take a lot of responsibility, to criticize himself and to own up to things he doesn't do well. It is strange, however, I think to come out in such forceful terms for what is fundamentally a misunderstanding. And obviously, I appreciate that, when it was run on Sky Sports News, when that initial clip was run on Sky Sports News, I saw it and it felt a little sensationalized.
Yeah.
For one thing, you didn't hear the question, which I thought was quite disappointing. I don't want to kind of get into criticizing fellow colleagues, but he didn't just throw that out of thin air. I also think one thing to note is that Arteta this season, and maybe this is a function of Zoom and things like that, has been tough with the press.
You think he's been tough or
combative?
Do you think that's been true all season, or do you think it's a case that as the season has gone on, he has been more under pressure, feeling a bit more defensive about, what's happened and where he is and all of those kind of things? Because, I'm in most of those press conferences as well on the Zoom and everything else. And, I think broadly, and, actually the vast majority of the kind of questions and questioning he gets is really very respectful. Nobody has really hammered him in any significant way. There have been some difficult questions, but then why wouldn't there be difficult questions for you to answer as a manager when your team doesn't do as well as it should do in the Premier League and gets knocked out of Europe, etc., etc.? I mean, that's part and parcel of the job.
I do think he tends to take umbrage with those questions more than I think is fair given where Arsenal are. And he's sort of very, very good at sort of saying, that there are standards and these aren't acceptable and we're not hitting them. But then when you sort of, from my experience, when you ask him, about his responsibilities on that, he can be a little more defensive. We would all naturally not take kindly to people questioning our ability to do our own job. And I totally understand that. And, we all, when these sort of things come to us on Twitter, none of us reply as sensibly as most football managers do. Having said that, I think, I found there were, I just certainly going back to that post-match Villarreal press conference, and I know that's a really emotive time, but I did find that, there was a kind of unwillingness to really engage with how, when when a fan's point of view is put across, I thought he was kind of not hugely open to discussing it. Maybe that's just natural. And I think, as you say, every manager gets testy and difficult in press conferences like these. And, Arsene Wenger was never the free-flowing Arsene Wenger that I was promised when I came into this job towards the end of his reign. He was just a little bit more defensive and very conscious of how every word can be misconstrued. I think we have to understand that everything Arteta says is put through a fine-tooth comb. We live in the era of full press conference transcripts, not just from the club, from all of us. And, every word is passed out for details, and every word is saved and can be brought back in 6 months' time. Everything he says about William Saliba is then compared to everything he says about Willian. I think that's hard. I think that's a lot harder than it was even five years ago. And I think he's probably maybe he's just really conscious of that, and he thinks sometimes he needs to stamp out on the stories he feels are most unrepresentative of the messages he's trying to get across. Sorry, to cut across. No, go on.
I just genuinely think that in his mind he answered one question, and in the media it was understandably as well, given that there was a follow-up question, the focus was on his answer to that question, and he thought, well, I answered the other question. I answered you judge yourself on the criteria of getting the best out of the players. Have you done that this season? And for the majority, yes, I have. And then all of a sudden it's being reported in a completely different way. I suppose the thing to say is that, he probably felt last night after a win that he could say something about that. He didn't say anything about it pre-game, and I'm not sure he could have said anything about it post-game had we lost. Maybe if we'd drawn the game, he might have been able to come out and say something about it. But I mean, where do you stand on his approach in general to things like that when he's talking about how he will always defend his players and all that kind of stuff, from accusations in the press and how much the players give him and how much commitment they have and how much work rate they give him, and they always work hard and and there have been performances this season where, look, I know teams can play below par and teams can be a little lethargic at times, but there have been times this season where you could look and say, have we really given enough? Have all the players given the best there? So it is sometimes difficult to tally with what we've seen, but as a stance for a manager to take, it is, even if fans don't like it at times, it is the best one to sort of build the wall around the inside, if you like.
Yeah, I find questions of effort, I always find it's a really challenging topic, because I think it's a really hard thing to I agree with you. There are games when I have watched Arsenal players or an Arsenal team and wondered if they were giving their all. But equally, I think it sometimes feels like a bit of a cop-out and an easy excuse for everything to just say, well, the players aren't working hard enough. And I think it can be really hard to know whether it's just they're not working hard enough, or they don't know where to be and when, or what the right thing is. And I think he is probably more right than he gets credit for in saying that actually, these players are working hard. And one thing that, he kind of acknowledged in that press conference, wasn't it, was that I think the message that really came out of it from his mouth, at least, or the one he intended, was, actually, I do believe my players are working hard, but I acknowledge that for some of them, even when they're working hard, they're not quite at the level required. Yeah, I mean, that was a more interesting thing for me than and look, I was guilty of falling into the answer that he gave initially. That's what I thought he had said. And it was only when I went back to listen today that I realized that, where this misunderstanding came from. But then he was asked, how do you get the maximum out of all of them in the future? And he said, challenging them, putting somebody next to them to try to push them again. So you've got a player who's X, but if you put a better player beside them, it might raise their level, as we've seen, I think, a few times this season with certain players. And he said, some of them can get to a certain level and you cannot push them any further. You want to evolve them, but it's not
possible. And I think what he's saying there, it's not that they're unreceptive to being pushed, or they're not unreceptive to the idea of working harder, but simply that they have a ceiling that it is not possible for them as players to go beyond. And I think that was maybe the most interesting part.
I thought that was fascinating, and it's one of those things where we all know that's true.
Yeah,
but actually, to acknowledge that is quite a significant step from an Arsenal manager. And I think, clearly he believes then that a lot of those players will be moving on, because you don't say that about someone. Let's be honest, there are going to be players in the squad who know that he meant them. We could name names if we wanted. I think that maybe last night we saw 100% Rob Holding, the best version of Rob Holding, and the best version of Rob Holding doesn't get Arsenal, or as a starting centre-back, doesn't get Arsenal in the Champions League conversation. I don't know if Arteta meant Holding, but
yeah. I know what you mean. Yeah,
there are half a dozen, maybe more players in the squad who are just like that. And if you believe that those players are kind of going to be moving on, or moving down the pecking order, you as a manager feel you can say that. If you think you're going to be working with them as your starters next season, you do not dream of saying that. So I thought that was a really interesting comment, and one that does sort of point to a real, and they're saying it so much, it's got to happen, but a real belief that this squad is going to be as radically overhauled as is possible in the summer.
I think it also speaks to a manager who feels, what's the right word here? Like, I don't know, or I can't say for sure, but I don't know that Mikel Arteta will feel comfortable in his job, because he's not a stupid man. He's not a stupid man. He knows his team didn't play well in a semi-final against a team managed by the man he replaced, and the optics of that, etc., are what they are, right? He knows that the team has lost 13 games in the Premier League. He's well aware of that, So I don't know that any manager could feel comfortable. Nevertheless, it sounds to me a bit like he feels assured by the backing he has had from executive level or board level or ownership level, whatever way you want to call it, because they all really break down to the same thing, that the sort of plan that he has and Edu has, we assume that they have to restructure the squad, to rebuild the squad, to get rid of certain players, to improve the squad in certain areas, what that might take in terms of recruitment, selling, loaning, finance, resources, all of those things which are, like if I was, brought in tomorrow to try and do all the things that Arsenal need to do, I'd probably last a day before I ran out the door screaming, So I have some sympathy with everything that they have to do, even if a lot of this mess is of their own making, of course. But it doesn't alter the fact that what needs to be done is a lot. But it does suggest to me that Arteta feels, or has had some assurance that, they've come so far down this particular road, they're not going to just turn around and start again.
I think there's a lot of that. And then there's a lot of him almost attempting to speak his vision for next season into existence. And we saw that last summer, didn't we? We saw, by the final weeks, he was sort of saying, I know this is going to happen. And, the day before Thomas Partey signed, I know we're going to do something significant. Now, if he's saying, I know this, partly that's sort of moving the pressure onto those above you and saying we kind of have to deliver. And I'm sure he appreciates that if this squad is not improved and it sort of stays similar to where it is now in terms of recruitment, if a lot of the players stay and new upgrades aren't made in key positions, that in the end the squad, they're not Arsenal going to sack the squad, they're going to sack Mikel Arteta, and obviously every indication that they're sticking by him over the summer, but he will know that if they're 10th or 8th or 9th in midway through the season, that he's not going to last. He knows that this is the decisive summer. And we constantly say, we have the decisive Europa League game and then we have the decisive summer. It seems like that's how Arsenal seasons are going of late. But this one is probably the most decisive of all. And he has to, if he wants this project to accelerate and he wants to be a successful Arsenal manager, he needs to pressure those above him to get the squad that he wants. And if he doesn't, he'll be fighting for his job. Yeah,
I mean, and another interesting aspect of this, and I know it's not something we can really quantify or go into a great detail in because we don't know all of it, but, more than once he has referenced things going on behind the scenes which have made life more difficult, and whether that's, from 5 years ago, 4 years ago, 1 year ago, 6 months ago, whatever it is, we're not quite sure, but he has spoken about this other thing, this undercurrent of something at Arsenal that has needed to be put right for a long time. So that, you assume, when he was brought in as manager, is something he identified, spoke to the ownership about, and was given the green light to do certain things, like even going back to January, the paying people to go away thing is not something that I've seen at any football club, certainly not seen it at Arsenal, that there have been some extraordinary things go on, which again, you like to think, if you're wildly or mildly even optimistic, that these are all part of one larger holistic plan of how to put things right.
It's a culture thing. And I think Arteta will be smart enough to know that the culture thing is not 3 or 4 players. I mean, certainly not, many of the players who arrived, that arrived at Arsenal, that left Arsenal paid to go away in January, they weren't difficult players when they arrived. I mean, we could debate how difficult they were during their time at Arsenal on and off the pitch. But they're, I think Arteta sees what the problem is, but actually it is still really hard. You've written about this club every day for 15, 20 years, however long the blog's been going. There is something in the culture around Arsenal, but it's very hard to put your finger on what it is. I mean, I think that to an extent it feels like an acceptance that winning doesn't have to be everything, but how that manifests on a day-to-day basis is really hard to know. I mean, you hear whispers, you hear, and you see it reflected in certain things on and off the pitch. But I think Arteta understands that there is that real cultural issue, and that perhaps the only time Arsenal in the post-Invincibles era really looked like they might be dealing with it was in that Arteta, Mertesacker era, when they became something of a winning force and probably hit the upper limits of their potential as the second, third best team in England. It's, this stuff is hard, and it requires boots on the ground and commitment from the absolute highest levels. I'm amazed we've got through the whole podcast without saying the K word, but that's what it comes down to. It's cultural drift. It's it's you listen to what Thomas Tuchel says about Chelsea and what he feels, the pressure he feels to win, that you suspect if Chelsea don't win the FA Cup and drop out of the top 4 and don't win the Champions League final, he will not be having any conversations about a new contract, no matter how much he's improved this team since Frank Lampard, because it's about winning. It's not about general progress. It is about picking up trophies and celebrating success at the end of the season. And I think that's why he always talks about the value of that FA Cup win. And he was talking before the Villarreal loss about how much of a boost the Europa League would bring. And I think we all naturally thought of that as finances and transfers and prestige. But I think part of it was about, these players getting into the habit that every season ends with them winning a big trophy and that they come back and go for a bigger one. It's nebulous. It's really hard to put your finger on, and Arteta alone cannot be the man to fix this. And Edu and Arteta and Richard Garlick alone, it has to be everyone at the club. And I know there are so many people that agree with Arteta, but it's hard, especially for a rookie head coach.
Well, true. And look, the thing about it is that there's, I think from the moment, you're talking about Chelsea, from the moment he arrived, it became clear that the only thing that was important to Abramovich was winning. That hasn't been the case with our owners. And I don't know that you can sort of instill the winning culture, so to speak, by proxy via the manager, because then it's ephemeral, isn't it? Because if the manager goes, that goes. So how do you change the outlook of the owners? Is that even possible? And if it's not possible, how much more responsibility and importance is there on the manager and the people he has around him to make up for that shortfall? Those are things that, I don't know that we can answer here, and nobody's yet been able to answer, fully. This summer could be quite interesting to see if there has been any kind of shift from KSE. I'm not sure there will be, but, it's something that Arteta, even in that interview the other day, let me see if I can find it here. It was quite interesting, where he was asked if potentially Arsenal would sacrifice some big players to raise funds for the summer. And he said, it's difficult to predict that one. In general, we wouldn't like to do that because we only want to be stronger. It's clear we want to improve the team. We need some resources. So whether that was a message to on high, I'm not quite sure. I don't know that, I'm not sure it's his style to sort of, do it the Mourinho way, if you like, to make it very clear to the owners that it's back me or get rid of me. And as Jose's found out of late, the getting rid thing is much more an option for the owners than he would like. But, we do need resources. And some of those, I think, are going to come from player sales. So just very finally, there were and are many issues, myriad issues, in terms of players and the squad, people who could go, people who could be sold, people who could be loaned. Realistically, there are 5, 6, maybe 7 who are basically unsellable at Arsenal at this moment in time for one reason or another. And everyone else, I think you have to be, in the circumstances we're in, open to any reasonable offer that comes in for those players. But, The Athletic this week did a big piece, and some of the names on it were not much of a surprise. David Luiz, just don't renew his contract. Willian, he wants to leave apparently, which would be great because, this is not to be like stick the knife in or anything like that. But I think it helps Arsenal if Willian wants to leave, because of the contract that we gave him in the first place. If he's not happy and he wants to go play football somewhere, that makes our life easier, rather than a guy who's going to say, well, you paid me all, you're going to pay me that money for 2 years and I'm going to sit here and do whatever I like for 2 years. So that he wants to leave is a big thing. Granit Xhaka, a little bit of a surprise to me. Bernd Leno, also a little bit of a surprise to me, because I think there are probably, I could think of 4, 5, maybe 6 things that we need to do before we need to worry about a goalkeeper, which isn't to say Leno couldn't be improved. It's true of everyone in the squad, but I don't think it's high on the list. So were you in any way surprised by some of the names that were doing the rounds this week? And realistically, how many of those players can Arsenal let go? I mean, I see people talking about, well, if you let all these experienced older players go, you lose leadership. And then I think, well, with these leaders, look where we are. Maybe you need new leaders, and maybe new leaders can only emerge when the old leaders are gone.
I think I wouldn't doubt for a moment anything if it's got David Ornstein's byline on it. Obviously, it's all well and good that the players wanting to leave. I think some of those players that want to leave may have uncomfortable conversations with their representatives this summer when it turns out who wants to buy them. If anyone, perhaps not at the level they expected. Yeah. I mean, obviously, someone like Hector Bellerin, as a reported back in January, he's kind of ready to move on. I think Arsenal are ready to let him move on. It's best for both parties. Where that interest might come from, though, is it a top-level Champions League team anymore? I kind of can't help but doubt. Huge admirer of Bellerin. off the pitch, and he has had fantastic moments on it, even this season. But he is not a consistent force. And are you so desperate to leave this club if you're not going to play Champions League football? I think that's similarly, that seems to be the indication coming out of from someone like Leno, who said in the press conference a few weeks ago, open to new adventures. Well, if that adventure is Borussia Dortmund, who I know he's been linked with, and they're exploring the market for goalkeepers from what I've heard, yeah, I'm sure Leno would be more than happy for that. But if it's not a Champions League team, are you that desperate to leave London, leave a good paying club?
Yeah.
It's an odd one. And, we were all talking last year as well. I was reporting, others were reporting that Arsenal wanted to sell Socrates, Ozil, Mustafi, Kolasinac. Well, people, it takes three to tango in this case. You need a player that's found a club he wants to go to, and a club that want to sign him. And there are quite a few. I mean, Lacazette would be another. Is there going to be a club that Lacazette wants to join? Because I think Arsenal should be really aggressively looking to move him on. You don't want to give him a new contract. You don't, unless you're really confident he can score you the goals that turn a Europa League place into a Champions League place. There is no financial justification for keeping him and letting him see out his contract. You've got to be aggressive. But, I think did you guys say this on the podcast on Monday? He's got to be, these are the players from the worst Arsenal team in a generation. They are on big wages. There are not a lot of teams that are crying out for them. It's going to be really hard. I do sympathise with Edu. He's done a lot, not well, but his only real sellable assets are talented youngsters who ideally you kind of would want to see a bit more of. He could get money for Willock, he could get money for Maitland-Niles, but you don't want to lose them and be stuck with veteran players that haven't performed for years on end.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, look, the fear of change is can be inhibiting actually a little bit, but the market also dictates what you can do and how much you can do it for. And I think, I don't know, I'm really curious to see, not just from an Arsenal perspective, obviously, with fans coming back into the stadiums next season, how are clubs going to operate in the market? Because it has been coming up on 18 months of huge loss and financial restriction and the impact of that on many clubs and the football pyramid, I'm sure hasn't played out fully yet. There's still desire from fans to see their clubs splash the cash and bring in new signings and new players, because new players are exciting. That is the reality from wherever you are in the football pyramid. If your club brings in a new player, it is an exciting thing. I just wonder, will someone take a risk, for example, and say, okay, we've lost a lot of money, but fans are back. I'm going to bank on there never being another stoppage like this in the lifetime. We can mortgage some of the future revenue that we're going to bring in to have a real go in a market which is probably depressed a little bit, and in which there might well be opportunities for clubs who are willing to put money down for players because other clubs are going to be desperate to take them. I do wonder what's going to happen. I mean, not just at Arsenal, but in the market in general. How active is it going to be? Is it going to be like 60% loan deals? It's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I have no idea. I remember this time last year we were talking about swap deals being the future. I don't really remember seeing any significance because, owners and clubs get carried away when they kind of believe whether it's, we can guarantee our safety in the Premier League at a lower level. If we spend this 50 million this summer, a newly promoted team, well, we'll make it back in a year if we can survive. Teams at Arsenal's level start convincing themselves, look, if we pay 45 million for Partey, 72 million for Pepe, that can be the difference between Europa League and Champions League. And, therefore it's the right thing to do to spend that money. Well, it's very hard to know from the outset. But I think, this will, as Chelsea proved, and it took them a while to get there, but, Chelsea have suddenly built the core of a contender, a long-term contender that they didn't really look like they had simply by saying, okay, this is a depressed market. Other teams can't go in for Kai Havertz or Timo Werner. They've not been perfect, but both of them are, players you'd want to be building a squad around. And they've just said, well, go for it. We're going to go for it now when other teams can't afford to match us. And I think there will be clubs that will believe that they can do that, and they will look at Chelsea and say, let's try and do that. I wonder if Arsenal might be one of them. That certainly is what KSE and Arteta would like you to believe from what they're saying.
Yeah. Well, yeah. They would like us to believe that, but I'm not sure anyone will until it actually happens. We've been there, done that. Like you said, we spent the money on Pepe, we spent the money on Partey, and now we, more than likely don't have any European football. So there's maybe something to be read into that. But look, we better leave it there. I've kept you far too long, but a pleasure to talk to you as always. James Benge, thank you very much.
Thanks as ever for having me.
Thank you very much indeed to James. You can find him on Twitter at James Benge, Plenty to talk about. And look, I know the season is ending soon and there's this period called the off-season, but I'm not sure, given everything that needs to be done at Arsenal, how much off there's going to be. I figure there's going to be a lot of on. There's going to need to be a lot of on. So we've got plenty to talk about this summer. We don't have anything to talk about this weekend, though, because the game that we were supposed to play against Crystal Palace is taking place on Wednesday. This is because fixtures have been rescheduled to give everybody a home game before the end of the season, because fans are allowed back into stadiums in limited capacities, which is great. So those of you who are going to be going to Brighton, the final game of the season next week, enjoy that. That's going to be really something, but it means that we don't have any Arsenal this weekend. Nevertheless, James and I will be here on Monday. We will have an Arsecast extra for you, and on Tuesday we'll do the usual stuff of previewing the game for Patreon members, etc., etc. In the meantime, maybe just switch off, have a nice, quiet, relaxing, Arsenal-free weekend. They can't do anything to us this weekend. Maybe those are famous last words. Some shit will go down and it'll be my fault. But look, in general, they can't make us sad because, well, there is no football. So whatever you do this weekend, take it easy, mind yourselves, look after one another. As ever, thank you very much indeed for listening. It's hugely appreciated, as always. And we will catch you on the next one. Until then, cheers, bye-bye.
Join us as we take another enchanting adventure into the world of the angriest man on Twitter.
Oi, Arsenal, you absolute wankers! You're not winning anywhere near enough games, dropping points all over the place this season, losing to Burnley twice, it's a disgrace! Losing to Aston Villa twice, losing to Everton twice, just a few of those points would have helped us get into a European place! It's all about results, you absolute bastards! Oi! Arsenal, you won a game against Chelsea away from home, a very difficult place to go, we all accept that, but what kind of a performance was that? You didn't play anywhere near as well as I wanted you to. It's all well and good getting results, but you've got to get results and performances, otherwise you can fuck off!
Next week, another madcap laugh-a-minute romp with the angriest man on Twitter.
Everything is shit!